They told us the screams were just echoes, that the stone walls made strange sounds at night, but we found the shackles, we found the stains, and we found the names. You were never meant to hear what I'm about to tell you. Not because it's untrue, because it's too true, buried so deep in church records, medical ledgers, and sealed government correspondences that only fire, blood, or betrayal could have ever brought it to light. And yet, here we are. The story of Thornhill Asylum is not a ghost story. It's worse. It's the story of what happens when morality is weaponized, when religion becomes a scalpel and children become the altar. In 1892, in a forgotten hamlet called Black Hollow, Virginia, stood a chapel. Not grand, not beautiful, but revered. Stone-cut, slate-roofed, surrounded by whispering pines. They said it was a haven for troubled youth. What they didn't say, what they never said, is what happened once the doors closed behind those children. Over 600 were sent to Thornhill. Officially, that's what the state ledgers recorded. But only 223 ever left a paper trail. The rest? Gone. No burial records, no transfers, just vanished. And for over a century, the Calderon family, founders of the asylum, priests in public, predators in private, kept their secrets sealed behind scripture and silence. But now we have the files, the hymn books, the blueprints, the hidden letters marked "Do Not Open," and you, if you have the stomach for it, will know what they hid, what they built. Thornhill was not just an asylum, it was an ideological engine, a machine for breaking minds under the mask of divine reform. They called it moral recalibration. We call it what it was, psychological warfare on children, sanctioned by the state, funded by the church, and forgotten by time. So before we go any further, I have to ask you something serious. Are you ready? Not for ghosts, but jump scares, for something worse. For a truth so dark it survived by hiding in plain sight. Because once you hear this, you don't go back. Not to comfort, not to ignorance, not to innocence. You'll begin to see the systems behind the symbols, the doctrine beneath the hymns, and the hunger behind the hands that fed them. You'll start to remember things you never lived, because they've been written on your bloodline since birth. We begin now, and once we begin, you are no longer the same. They say architecture is a reflection of belief. So what does it mean when a building feels wrong? When the moment you step near it, your stomach tightens, your breath shortens, and your instincts scream that you've entered sacred space, not for worship but for sacrifice. Thornhill Asylum wasn't built like a hospital. It wasn't even built like a church. It was built like a prison pretending to be a cathedral. Imported grey stone, black-stained glass, a chapel that rose first, before beds, before kitchens, before light. Because what they were worshipping needed containment, not comfort. The Calderons knew this. Reverend Silas Calderon, the patriarch, claimed to have received visions during the Civil War, not of angels, but of fractured souls in the bodies of children. He returned from battle not as a healer, but as a purifier, and Black Hollow gave him exactly what he needed: isolation, desperation, and an abundance of children no one would miss. He brought with him his wife Temperance and 5 adult children, each more disturbed than the last. Elias, the physician who never registered with any board. Josephine, the choir girl who composed hymns for correction rituals. The twins, Nathaniel and Mercy, who ran daily operations and disciplinary reconditioning. And Silas's brother, Dr. Alban Calderon, a neurologist stripped of his credentials but never his tools. What they created beneath Thornhill was never listed in any report. 12 basement rooms, each windowless, each soundproofed, each outfitted with restraints and drainage trenches. The floor plans were hidden behind false walls, cloaked by misfiled blueprints in state archives. But they existed, and every square inch was designed for silence. They didn't need guards. They had doctrine. They didn't need locks. They had fear. You see, the genius of Thornhill wasn't just its brutality. It was its belief. These weren't monsters torturing children for pleasure. That would be easier to process. No. They believed they were saving them. That pain was purification. That breaking a child's will was the first step toward divine obedience. This wasn't chaos. This was organized transcendence through suffering. And that's the part that should terrify you most. Because if men can be convinced that mutilation is mercy, then what else have they convinced us to accept in the name of progress or patriotism or peace? Keep listening. You haven't even reached the deepest part of the basement. Imagine being 8 years old. Your mother is dead, your father gone. A stranger in a black coat says you're going somewhere safe, where good children are made better and bad ones become good. You ride a cart through rain-soaked woods up to a place that looks more like a mausoleum than a home. You don't know it yet, but you've arrived at Thornhill Asylum, and your life has just ended, even if your heart keeps beating for a while longer. They called it an intake, but what it really was a sorting. Upon arrival, each child was observed, not comforted, not welcomed. Observed. How they walked, how they responded to eye contact, whether they flinched, cried, or showed signs of defiance. A wrong word could brand you a Category 3. And if you were labeled Category 3, you never saw the dormitories. You were sent directly to the reflection wing. Reflection. A beautiful word. But at Thornhill, it meant starvation, cold, solitude. Some were kept in cells for days, others weeks. No names, no voices, just the creak of floorboards above and the whimper of those not yet broken. If you screamed, you were resisting grace. If you went silent, you were praised. Not for healing, for compliance. And if you still didn't submit, they escalated. Enter Mercy Calderon. Don't be fooled by the name. Mercy was the system's blade. She ran the correctional trials in the reflection wing, and what she did was not discipline. It was psychological dismantling. Cold baths in winter, withholding food and water, forced kneeling for hours, sometimes days until the legs gave out. And if that didn't work, they had Mercy's draft. A formula, brewed by Dr. Alban and Mercy together. A cocktail of opium vinegar and mercury chloride, administered in drops to make the child compliant, pliable, hollow. One witness said the children who took it stopped blinking. Another said they'd just stare at nothing. And still, the church called it charity. Still, the town sent more children, and still the state signed off, blindfolded by paperwork and prayer. Now think about this. If a child disappears in a forest and no one is there to hear them scream, do they ever truly vanish, or are they absorbed into the system, into the silence, into the myth of moral reform? You were told this was history. But I'm telling you now, this is prophecy in reverse. Because Thornhill wasn't the end, it was the beginning. There's a moment in every descent where the world above starts to feel like a dream, where your memories fade, your instincts dull, and all that's left is what they allow you to feel. Thornhill was built to create that moment, not just in children, but in you, because what they learned inside those walls wasn't obedience, it was surrender. Let's go deeper. Beneath the chapel, beyond the 12 reflection cells, there was a door, not marked, not locked, but layered behind a series of false stone panels. Behind it was a room the staff called Observation B. The children called it the mouth, and for good reason. The walls were warm to the touch, despite no known heating. The floor sloped downward in a spiral, like descending into the belly of something ancient. And in the center, suspended by black iron beams, was the chair. Not a throne, not a restraint unit, just the chair. Wooden, backless, child-sized, and angled slightly forward to ensure the subject never leaned back. This is where Dr. Alban Calderon worked, or, as he referred to it in his writings, received divine signals. He didn't speak often in public, but his journals, salvaged from a barn fire in 1981, are chilling in their clarity. He believed the mind could be corrected through a process of disorientation, suggestion, and reward withdrawal, a process we now understand as a crude form of trauma-based programming. Except he wasn't just experimenting, he was documenting, logging how long it took for a child to stop using their name, tracking how many sessions it took before a subject would recite a new belief on command. And here's where it gets darker. He kept audio records. Wax cylinder recordings, 5 of which were recovered in 1992 by university researchers. The contents? Children repeating phrases in unison, phrases like, "Pain cleans the mirror," "Mercy is the blade," "He who cries cysts." You can hear the breaks in their voices, the dry throats, the missing teeth. You can hear when a child gives in, not just physically but spiritually. That sound doesn't leave you. They weren't training saints. They were building obedient echoes. So ask yourself, why go through all this trouble? Why ritualize the breaking of the human mind? Because the Calderons weren't just reformers. They were architects of silence, and Thornhill was their cathedral. Silence is never empty. It's shaped, engineered, directed, and in Thornhill, silence was more than absence. It was evidence. Every missing voice was proof the system worked. Every unanswered scream, a sacrament. You might think, surely someone knew, someone from the outside, a priest, a teacher, a nurse, anyone with a conscience. And you're right. Some did know, but knowing isn't the same as acting, especially when the institution wears the mask of holiness. In 1875, a nurse named Margaret Bellamy joined Thornhill for what was supposed to be a 6-month rotation. Freshly trained, idealistic, and deeply religious, she believed Thornhill's mission was noble. She lasted 3 weeks. In a letter to her sister, later recovered from a family trunk, she wrote, "There is something beneath the chapel. The children go in with names and leave without them. I hear hymns at night, but I don't think they're sung by choice." Margaret filed a report to the Kentucky Board of Mental Health. She described bruising on the children, locked rooms she wasn't permitted to enter, and a smell that reminded her of old copper and vinegar. 3 weeks later, she was institutionalized for melancholic hysteria. 8 months later, she was dead. The official cause? Self-starvation. The real cause? Silencing. This is the pattern. Speak out. Disappear. Ask questions. Lose your name. Thornhill didn't just break children. It broke anyone who tried to protect them. But there was one exception. Her name was Eleanor Witt, the woman in white. Officially, she was a laundress, unremarkable, widow, no children, just another poor soul looking for work. But Eleanor had a purpose. She'd treated children from Thornhill before, those few who escaped, and when the opportunity came to go inside, she took it. For 3 years, she worked beneath the Calderons' noses, quiet, invisible, but always watching. And in that time, she created a ledger, stitched symbols into bedsheets, wrote names on scraps of linen, hid broken hymns in laundry bins. She documented 22 names that never appeared in Thornhill's public records, names of children who were unaccounted for, and in one hidden drawer behind her quarters, she left a bottle, handwritten label, Mercy's Draft, Test 4C. It contained opium, mercuric chloride, and traces of something darker, something synthetic. Thornhill wasn't just a place of punishment. It was a laboratory. And the children? They weren't patients. They were prototypes. Let's pull back the veil a little more. You've been told Thornhill was a singular horror, a rogue institution led by a fanatical family. That's the story we're given. It's easier that way, easier to believe the rot was contained. But that's a lie. Because in 1878 something changed. Reverend Silas Calderon began receiving letters, not from grieving families, not from state officials, but from men of influence, physicians, clergy, industrialists, judges, men who believed the post-war South was morally diseased and in need of cleansing. They formed a quiet alliance, a hidden syndicate, and they called themselves the Society for Moral Architecture. They didn't meet in churches, they met in estates, private homes with locked parlors and blackout curtains. They didn't record minutes, they exchanged encoded letters, marked only with the sign of the tilted cross, an inverted crucifix, leaning just off-center, as if to say, "We still believe, just differently." And Thornhill was their blueprint. Silas Calderon wasn't just an operator, he was a prophet to them, a man who'd gone further than any academic, further than any theologian. He'd systematized what they had only theorized, how to erase will and rebuild it in obedience. They funded him, supplied him, protected him. One of the Society's earliest backers was Dr. Malcolm Hale, a phrenologist from Boston who never once visited Thornhill, but donated over $5,000 in surgical equipment. That's $150,000 in today's terms. Why? Because he believed the brain could be restructured through calibrated trauma. Thornhill became his testing ground. Let that sink in. Behind the hymns and the stained glass, there were metrics. Files marked not with names, but with codes. Subject 42C, mulatto female, collapse achieved in 72 hours, viable for replication. This was not rehabilitation. This was replication. Proof of concept. You might be wondering, why children? Why not adults? Because children don't have walls, they don't have defenses, they can be shaped or erased. And if you can rewrite the soul of a child, you can manufacture loyalty, not just for one generation, but for all who come after. This wasn't just about Thornhill, it was about a model, one that could be expanded, one that was expanded. And if you think it ended in 1892, you haven't been paying attention. Here's where the descent gets darker, not just because of what was done, but because of who allowed it. Let me ask you something. How does a place like Thornhill last for nearly 30 years without public outrage, without a single trial, without a single newspaper headline? The answer is brutal in its simplicity. People believed it was working, and why wouldn't they? The Calderons were experts at appearances. Reverend Silas delivered firebrand sermons in neighboring churches. Josephine played angelic hymns in county recitals. Elias donated to medical supply drives. The chapel hosted prayer circles open to the public. But those were masks, carefully constructed illusions. Because behind the altar, behind the velvet curtain, was the penumbra, a Latin word meaning edge of the shadow. A place never seen by the public, a trapdoor cleverly built beneath the pulpit that led to the real Thornhill, the one no one talked about. Survivors, the few who escaped or were released after successful reform, spoke of a different Thornhill, one where children were woken in the dead of night by bells, one where those who cried were denied water for 3 days, one where a single infraction, stuttering during scripture, laughing during prayer, could lead to isolation in the dark. One boy, aged 9, was confined for 7 days without speaking. When asked his name after release, he replied, "They gave me a new one, but the records never listed it." Now consider this. When state auditors revisited the Thornhill case files in 1968, long after the asylum was shut down, they found something chilling. The institution had received enough state vouchers and supplies for over 600 children during its operation, but official records list only 223. That means nearly 400 children simply vanished. No discharge papers, no death certificates, no graves. Just gone. You want to know where they went. So did forensic geologists who in 1994 conducted ground-penetrating radar scans behind the chapel. They found 17 depressions, rectangular, evenly spaced, roughly 4 feet long, not from erosion, not from nature, from something buried. And underneath those depressions, charred timber, a burn chamber, ash mixed with calcium, calcium from bone. So ask yourself again, how did no one stop this? Because the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. They didn't hide Thornhill, they institutionalized it. Now we leave the realm of shadows and enter the furnace, not metaphorically, literally. Behind Thornhill's east wing was a small structure marked in blueprints as Maintenance Annex C. It looked unremarkable. A single chimney, one wooden door, no windows, but inside was the furnace. Not for heating, for disposal. In 1997, A team of independent forensic investigators gained access to the Thornhill grounds under a grant for historic rural reconstruction. They weren't looking for bodies, but that's exactly what they found. Traces of burned human remains embedded in old chimney soot, calcium phosphate embedded in brickwork, and most damning of all, metal restraint clasps fused with melted bone ash. The burn chamber hadn't just been used, it had been optimized. See, there are two ways to hide atrocities: conceal them or ritualize them. Thornhill chose both. When a child became non-viable, they weren't mourned, they weren't buried, they were returned to the source. That's the phrase Silas used in his letters. We return them to the source. It is a mercy for the clay that could not hold the breath. And the furnace? It was mercy's altar. Now understand this. These weren't secret sacrifices performed in isolation. They were documented, itemized. There are invoices, not just for fuel, but for shipment of irregular waste. Records showing multiple deliveries of lime, kerosene, and sealed crates transported to nearby rail depots, always marked with the same initials: SMA. Society for Moral Architecture. So here's the hard truth. The burnings were authorized. And what was lost in flame was more than flesh. It was identity. No grave, no marker, no proof. Just another adjustment in the ledgers. This wasn't just about the 400 lost children. It was about what the society learned in the fire. They weren't testing morality. They were testing scalability. Could the Thornhill system, silence, obedience, obliteration, be refined, exported, used elsewhere? And the answer was yes. Because after Thornhill, similar facilities began to appear across the South. Different names, different faces, but the same methods. Reflection wings, moral reconditioning, silence as success. So if you think this story is just about a building, you're not listening. It's about a design, and that design, it survived. By now you may be feeling it, the shift, that crawling sensation down your spine that whispers, this isn't just a story, it's a structure, a system. Because Thornhill was never just one place, it was a template. And the Society for Moral Architecture, they weren't interested in punishment. They were interested in patterns. How long does it take to erase a name? How many days without light before a child stops resisting? Which sedatives induce obedience without killing the host? They compiled it all, charts, ratios, case studies, and in 1883 they built something new. Just 40 miles from Black Hollow, hidden within the timber country near Lewis Fork, they opened a textile factory for reclaimed youth. Officially, it was a Christian work program, a place where reformed children from Thornhill could learn a trade. Unofficially, it was Thornhill's feeder system. Children were transferred there after surviving the reflection wing. Most were under 10. Every morning at 3:00 a.m., they were woken by a bell. No breakfast, no shoes, just hours of weaving, cutting, binding. Those who fell behind were marked for reassessment. You know what reassessment meant by now, don't you? Return to the penumbra. Return to observation B. Return to the chair. Now here's what few people know. In 1901, a whistleblower emerged. A former society accountant named Almon Pierce fled Kentucky and leaked over 300 pages of documents to a Baltimore journalist. Receipts, letters, schematics, even a hand-drawn diagram of a modular reflection chamber designed for mobile transport, loaded onto rail cars. You heard that right. They tried to make Thornhill portable. They called it the Mercy Train. It disappeared off records in 1903, last seen near Missouri, where 4 children went missing from a county orphanage and were never seen again. Coincidence or continuation? But here's where we dig even deeper, because Almon Pierce didn't just leak files. He recorded a final testimony before disappearing. In it, he said something that still echoes in my mind. They don't want to cure evil, They want to own obedience, and they've learned the most efficient way is to start with those no one will miss. Let that sink in. Not criminals, not rebels, but children, alone, forgotten, erased. Because when no one looks for you, you become the perfect test. Now, before we continue to section 10, I want you, the viewer, to do something. Comment this phrase below twice. I see the penumbra. Once for memory, twice for identity. Let's wake the algorithm and the truth. We've spoken of ashes. Now let's speak of echoes, because some screams don't die in fire. They linger, etched into walls, threaded into soil, humming just beneath memory. And for Thornhill, those echoes began to surface again in the strangest of places. Not in graveyards, not in ruins, but in modern institutions, places where the language shifted, but the logic stayed the same. In 1921, a reform school was opened in South Carolina. On paper, it was built to uplift delinquent boys of color. But a Freedom of Information Act request in 2006 revealed archived intake documents marked with codes nearly identical to Thornhill's, Category 3, Refractory Type B, Non-Respondent. Sound familiar? The Society for Moral Architecture had vanished from public record by 1909. But their taxonomy survived, repackaged, renamed. The reflection wing became the adjustment corridor. The penumbra became the silence dormitory, and the children, still referred by number, still removed for corrective rites. You may ask, was it the same people? No, something worse. It was the same ideology. Because when a system proves effective, not just for control but for profit, it doesn't need a cult to survive. It becomes bureaucracy. Thornhill wasn't destroyed. It was absorbed, integrated into juvenile justice systems, psychiatric models, experimental pharmacology. You think Mercy's draft, that opiate mercury sedative, was a relic. In 1954, children at the Willowbrook State School in New York were forcibly given experimental hepatitis vaccines. The doctor who authorized it cited controlled exposure for improved compliance. That phrasing, it's almost word for word from the doctrine of broken things. Still think this is just history? Still think it ended? The truth is, every generation finds new words to mask old rituals. We stopped calling it obedience training and started calling it behavioral modification. We stopped calling them broken children and started calling them non-neurotypical subjects. But the blueprint never changed. Isolate, restrain, rewire. You want to know how Thornhill's legacy survives? Look no further than certain private youth camps, military academies, correctional boarding schools with shadowy funding and no federal oversight. Many still use hymns. Many still use silence. Some even still use the word reflection. Because when a method is born in shadows, it survives not through exposure, but through replication. Thornhill was the seed. The roots are everywhere. Here's a question they never want you to ask. What happens to the architects when their buildings fall? What happens to the Calderons, to the family that branded obedience as salvation and used children's bones as mortar? The answer isn't satisfying, because monsters rarely die in fire. They vanish into systems, reappear in titles. Their names may fade, but their doctrine remains. Let's trace it. Reverend Silas Calderon died in 1896. Cause of death, congestive collapse. But the autopsy, performed privately by Elias, was never submitted to state records. What was submitted instead? A sealed will. It transferred ownership of the remaining Thornhill land to a religious trust headquartered in Roanoke, Virginia, a trust that still exists today under the name Order of the Ninefold Mercy. Sound benign? It shouldn't. Because the order now manages 3 private youth shelters in rural Appalachia, all with the same emblem, an archangel holding a sword over a weeping child, the same image that loomed over Thornhill's altar. Coincidence? Let's keep going. Elias Calderon, the in-house physician. He vanished. No obituary, no public record of burial. But in 1902, a man named Dr. Ellis Rowan began publishing medical studies on moral reconditioning through sensory deprivation. His photo, a blurred figure with Elias's same deep-set eyes and surgical scar above the brow. But here's what matters most. His paper was funded by a group called the MA Circle. That stands for what exactly? Moral architecture. Still think this was just a family? Still think this was just Kentucky? Let's turn to Josephine Calderon, the pianist, the most terrifying of them all. According to surviving Thornhill attendees, she died in 1892 of self-inflicted burns, a rare, grotesque suicide, or so the legend goes. But in 1923, an anonymous article appeared in a defunct occultist newsletter based in Philadelphia. The author, J.C. Title: The Doctrine of Broken Things, on Sacred Silence and the Shattering of the Soul. It was a word-for-word excerpt from the original Calderon manuscript, including the chilling passage, "He who screams is still resisting. He who submits becomes clay." Josephine wasn't dead. She was publishing. She was teaching. And her words, once whispered in the chapel basement, were now echoing through secret societies, fringe theology, and experimental psychology. You see, institutions can fall, but ideologies, they slip into cracks. They haunt textbooks. They rename themselves until even the victims forget what they were running from. And that's why this story still matters. Because some blueprints are never burned. They're just copied. Let's take a breath. Not to rest, but to go deeper. Because now we stop following names and start following rituals. Every power structure has a language, a code not written in words but in actions repeated until belief hardens into doctrine. Thornhill's power wasn't just in its cruelty, it was in how that cruelty was orchestrated, choreographed, sacred. Let me show you. In 1984, a researcher named Dr. C. Eldridge discovered a handwritten ritual log buried in the archives of the Kentucky State Sanitarium. It was labeled only Chapel Sequences, 1874 to 1888. Inside were 112 entries, each describing a nightly routine performed inside Thornhill's chapel basement. The steps were always the same: lights extinguished, doors bolted. Psalm 51 recited 3 times in Latin. The child placed in the center, the hammer passed, the hymn begun. No speaking after the 4th verse. The hammer, Eldridge believed, referred to a brass gavel discovered decades later during excavation, its head stained with what forensic teams confirmed as blood, calcium, and chloroform residue. They called it the waking tool. Not to wake a child from sleep, but to wake them from resistance. The hymn, always the same. Break me not, for I am made, to burn and serve, to kneel and fade. No voice but yours, no will but flame. O mercy's hand, erase my name. This wasn't treatment. This was liturgy. The same words, the same sequence, night after night, child after child, until obedience was no longer taught, it was summoned. Now listen closely, because here's where it becomes systemic. In the 1970s, reports began surfacing from now-defunct juvenile centers in North Carolina and Tennessee. Former residents claimed they were awoken in the night, marched to a dark chamber, and made to sing a song they'd never learned before. No voice but yours, no will but flame. How? How does a hymn from 1880 echo in institutions 100 years later? Because the song wasn't taught, it was programmed. The doctrine of broken things included an entire section on impression training, exposing children to certain phrases, melodies, and sounds during states of deprivation so deeply that it etched into subconscious memory. And the effect? Those children would hum the tune even decades later, without knowing where they learned it. Because their minds had been ritualized, conditioned not through punishment, but worship. Worship of pain, of silence, of surrender. You still think Thornhill was about reform? No. It was a church, Its God was control. Its gospel was obedience. And its altar was a child too scared to scream. This is where things get harder. Because now we leave behind the files and blueprints and descend into the personal. Not long ago, a man named Jared H. came forward. He wasn't a historian. He wasn't even looking for Thornhill. He was just a contractor, hired to renovate a decaying church property in rural Virginia. You can guess what it was. Yes, Thornhill Chapel. The building had been sold decades earlier to a private religious group that used it as a youth reflection center. Jared's job was simple: tear out the rot, reinforce the beams, and leave the original stone untouched. But 2 weeks into the project, something changed. He and his team found a sealed room behind the apse, a stone wall with no entry point visible from inside. It wasn't listed on any blueprint. They broke through. Inside was a chair, bolted to the floor, straps decayed but still in place. Above it, a metal fixture with long burnt wiring, and carved into the wall behind the chair, scratched in shaky human lines, 5 words: "Don't forget what they did." Jared didn't understand, not at first. But when he showed the photos to a local archivist, they pointed to something chilling. The wiring matched 19th century galvanic stimulation devices, early electrotherapy. This wasn't a restraint room, it was a testing site, a place where children were hooked up to wires, exposed to current, and studied for moral responsiveness. In other words, if they screamed, they were still sinful. If they were silent, they were ready. And here's the part Jared couldn't explain. For weeks after discovering the room, every time he entered the chapel, his crew's equipment malfunctioned. Lights flickered, tools lost power. One man, a welder, said he heard a hymn playing through the metal of the wall. No radio, no electricity, just a song, humming like breath beneath stone. Eventually, Jared quit the project, but not before leaving a final note taped to the chapel door. "This place doesn't want to be opened. Some things are buried for a reason. If you're reading this, don't go looking." But we did look, because this story isn't about respecting silence. It's about shattering it. So if you feel haunted, if this weight follows you long after the video ends, it should. That's not your imagination. That's the penumbra, whispering your name. Because once you know, you can't unknow. You've seen the doctrine, you've heard the hymn, and you've stepped, willingly, into the shadows they built to keep you obedient. What if I told you they were still watching? Not the Calderons, their bones are dust, but the system they helped refine. It watches, it adapts, and it tests. Every few years, stories surface, quiet, muffled, quickly buried. A boy disappears from a reform camp. A girl is found wandering barefoot, eyes vacant, mumbling in rhyme. Facilities are shut down. New ones open under different names. You're told these are isolated events, but they're not. They are continuations. Because the blueprint we've followed, from Thornhill's rituals to Josephine's doctrine, from electrotherapies to behavioral sequencing, it didn't die. It evolved. In 2019, a leaked document from a corporate-sponsored juvenile resilience center in southern Missouri outlined a compliance framework for non-verbal resistant minors. The phrase they used: progress through collapse. Direct quote from the Doctrine of Broken Things. Coincidence? No. Because a man named Dr. Malcolm R. Hale helped write it. The grandson of Dr. Malcolm Hale, the phrenologist who funded Thornhill in 1879. Same family, same language, same mission. You think this is just legacy? This is inheritance. These systems aren't just lingering, they are protected, funded, rebranded under clinical terms like adaptive cognition and trauma realignment. Ask yourself this: why do some youth centers still isolate children in rooms with no clocks? Why are restraint reports sealed by private contractors? Why do so many lawsuits against these institutions settle in silence? Because silence is still the goal. Because a broken child is easier to repurpose than a defiant one. And the deeper you dig, the more you realize something sickening. We didn't stop Thornhill. We just made it scalable, digitized it, marketed it, and taught future generations to call it care. And that's why you're here. That's why you're watching. Because somewhere inside, you feel it too. That something old is still breathing just beneath the surface of today. It wears a suit now, not robes. It files reports instead of doctrine. But the intention is unchanged, to erase those who do not comply, to sanctify pain by calling it progress, to control through ritual disguised as science. Now ask yourself, if Thornhill never really ended, what other institutions never really began? It's time now. Time to see the system behind the story, not just Thornhill, but the architecture of obedience it exposed. Every civilization has its myths, every empire its sacred rules. But what they never tell you is this: obedience must be built, not taught, not earned, engineered. Let's pull back. Thornhill wasn't just a house of horrors. It was a prototype, a living laboratory designed to answer one question: how do you break a human being so thoroughly? They beg you to tell them what's true. And here's the terrifying part. It worked. Modern systems, military indoctrination, cult initiation, high-control rehab centers, they all follow the same sequence pioneered in Thornhill's basement. Isolation. Strip away familiar faces, names, comforts. Disorientation. Remove time, light, and rhythm. Symbolic language. Replace meaning with doctrine. Controlled pain. Introduce trauma, then offer relief. Guided dependency. Present yourself as salvation. This is not therapy. This is spiritual hacking. And it didn't stop with children. The very concept of moral reformation through collapse has shown up in black site interrogation manuals, prison systems, corporate behavior labs, and elite initiation societies. They just changed the language. They don't say obedience anymore. They say compliance. They don't say ritual. They say curriculum. They don't say punishment. They say therapy. But the goal remains: to erase the voice inside you that says no. You think you're immune? Look around. Your screen tracks you. Your feed predicts your fears. Your choices are filtered through invisible permissions. And when you finally raise your voice, when you scream, they tell you it's a glitch, that the system is too big to fight, that obedience is safety, that truth is best left forgotten. So I want you to say something, right now, something this locks this moment into your bones. Type it in the comments twice to prove you're not asleep. I was made for truth. I was made for truth. Because this isn't just a story. It's an awakening. And Thornhill, that chapel of screams, was only the beginning. Do you know what happens to a person who's broken, rebuilt, and programmed, but never told why? They become a weapon, not of violence, of order. Let me introduce you to the reconditioned. That's what internal Thornhill documents called them. Children who survived the penumbra. Children who didn't die, didn't resist, didn't run. They adapted. They became silent, smiling, obedient. They folded their beds with military precision. They quoted scripture in perfect cadence. They reported other children who tried to escape. The Calderons didn't consider these children healed. They considered them finished. Their will has been cleared, wrote Elias. They are useful now, but useful to who? That's where this turns darker, because some of the reconditioned, roughly 11 based on surviving logs, weren't released into society. They were transferred. The records list vague destinations: M Group, East Site, Seminary Division, Off Registry. Private assignment, C, Hale Authority. These weren't orphanages, they were facilities. And thanks to researcher Maeve Kennelly, who traced transport manifests in 2003, we now know at least 4 reconditioned children ended up in a location that no longer officially exists: Black Hollow Facility, Virginia, classified as an agricultural vocational school for displaced youth. But soil scans show no crop activity, only subterranean architecture. And in one photo taken by a trespassing urban explorer in 1997, a rusted doorway is visible, carved into the metal. Obedience is the final prayer. Same phrase found under Thornhill's altar. Same phrase whispered by former residents of a Montana-based wilderness rehab camp in the 1980s. Same phrase scratched into the underside of a bunk bed in a Texas Youth Correctional Institute, 2006. They tried to bury it, but the system can't help repeating itself because the auditioned weren't just victims, they were carriers. Each one a living echo of Thornhill, each one proof that obedience, once installed, spreads. That's how this works. You don't need to keep the building, you just need to keep the ritual alive, in the bodies of those who survived it. His name was Caleb Wren, and unlike the others, he ran. In the winter of 1887, 2 years before Thornhill's final closure, a 12-year-old boy broke from the reflection wing during a snowstorm. He'd spent 19 months in the asylum, Category 3, evaluated by Elias, watched by Josephine, twice marked for reassignment. But Caleb was clever. He feigned compliance, memorized patrol patterns, and on the night of December 3rd, under cover of white silence, he slipped through a service hatch near the laundry furnace and vanished into the woods of Black Hollow. For months, the Calderons claimed he had been moved to a distant sanatorium, but they knew the truth. He escaped. And here's the thing. He lived. In 1899, a man named Caleb Wren was admitted to a psychiatric ward in Philadelphia under his real name. He was arrested for disturbing the peace after shouting scripture in tongues on a train platform. But during his 11-month confinement, he filled 5 journals. They were never published, but in 2001, a doctoral student named R. Shea digitized the entries and posted fragments to a now-defunct archive forum. The contents? Haunting. I know the hymns backwards, but they still hurt forward. They kept the quiet ones to make them quieter. The woman in white gave me my name back. They made me forget my face so I couldn't be found again. But God keeps faces in the roots, and I buried mine behind the second bell. He was disjointed, fragmented, but there was one clear truth. Caleb remembered. And most chilling of all, one entry reads, "When I was asleep, I dreamed of the new halls, white walls, steel mouths. The lights never turn off. The rules are the same, but no one says the prayers anymore." That was written in 1899. Decades before the first government-funded behavioral modification camps, before the birth of modern clinical detainment, before the rise of state-sanctioned developmental discipline centers, he saw them coming. Because Thornhill wasn't the end of the road, it was the beginning of the map. And Caleb Wren? He left markers. In his final journal, a line appears that should make every hair on your body stand up. It's not over when you leave the place. It's over when the place leaves you. So now I ask you, has it left you? Or are you starting to feel watched? She was called Mercy, but nothing about her lived up to the name. Mercy Calderon, the youngest daughter of Silas, twin to Nathaniel, keeper of the reflection wing. But to the children she was something else, the quiet knife. Because Mercy didn't raise her voice, she didn't scream, she whispered, and when she whispered, things changed. According to surviving documents, Mercy was the architect of compliance, not the ideology that came from Silas, not the surgical refinements, that was Elias. But Mercy, she broke their minds. In the winter of 1876, Mercy began conducting unofficial experiments on what she called resistance dilation thresholds. Her notes were later discovered in an old steamer trunk found beneath the east stairwell during the 1984 investigation. What they described was methodical, almost scientific, always cruel. Child 14D, given Mercy's draft 4C. Vocal dissociation achieved in 9 hours. No tears after hour 11. Initiate mirror test. Let me explain that. The mirror test was Mercy's personal invention. After drugging the child with an opiate and mercuric compound, enough to induce dissociation, the child was placed in front of a mirror under bright light, then left there, alone, for hours. The goal? To watch them forget their own face. The records show 37 children underwent the mirror test. Only 9 were deemed spiritually realigned. The rest? Unclear. But here's where it gets worse. Mercy's name doesn't just appear in Thornhill's files, it shows up in 2 other asylum transcripts, both in Louisiana, both dated post-1890, and both referencing a traveling discipline specialist known only as Sister Calderon. The dates match, the methods match, the silence matches. She didn't die with Thornhill. She moved on. And her techniques, the drug formulas, the mirror protocols, the acoustic fasting rooms, they show up again and again in mid-20th century documents under new names: cognitive quieting therapy, sensory void calibration, post-assertive reconstruction. Sound technical? That's the point. Rebrand the torture, sanitize the ritual, call it progress. Mercy Calderon's shadow stretches long, far beyond Kentucky, because obedience systems don't need monuments, they just need practitioners. So next time you hear about a tough love youth camp, next time someone praises discipline over dysfunction, ask yourself, is it Mercy, just wearing a new name? For 32 years, Thornhill Asylum stood unchallenged. No arrests, no audits that mattered, no prosecutions, until one fire and one forgotten report began the slow unraveling of the entire Calderon empire. It was October 3rd, 1897. A lightning storm had rolled through the hollow. At 3:12 a.m., a bolt struck the eastern bell tower, igniting the old timber crossbeam and sending sparks raining down into the chapel loft. By morning, half the asylum had burned. At first, it seemed like an accident, a tragic end to a misunderstood place. But then something unexpected happened. The insurance inspector, a man named Isaac Trevane, refused to sign off on the final report. He said the fire was too clean, that the pattern of the burn showed signs of accelerant placement, that someone had used the storm as cover. He suspected arson. But Isaac Trevane wasn't just an inspector. He was also a former seminarian, and during his days at seminary, he'd studied under a mentor who once tried to expose Reverend Silas Calderon. Trevane had heard the stories. So instead of filing the report, he requested permission to inspect the sub-basement, which according to the official Thornhill blueprint, didn't exist. What he found changed everything. Beneath the altar, through a burned trapdoor and a partially collapsed stairwell, Trevane uncovered the penumbra, the reflection cells, the silent chamber, and a locked storage room containing 9 trunks of patient records. Inside, categorized experiment logs, sedation formulas, baptismal death charts, and dozens of letters of correspondence between Silas Calderon and other moral sanctuaries across the South. Most damning, a wax-sealed ledger marked Initiate Transfer, Fall, 1897, listing 7 children set for relocation just days after the fire. Next to their names, the initials MC, Mercy Calderon. She was preparing to restart it elsewhere. The fire didn't destroy Thornhill, it protected the exit. But Trevane didn't stay quiet. He brought the documents to Louisville, contacted a state senator, and within months, a closed-door investigation began, quietly but decisively. They didn't arrest the Calderons. No, they buried them. The chapel was razed, the land sold off to a shell company, survivors relocated or silenced, files sealed until 1972. And as for the Calderon name, scrubbed from every registry. But here's the truth. They didn't destroy the evidence, they just hid it well enough to make you forget to look. Until now, they called it the dusting. Not a legal term, not a formal file, just a whispered phrase among archivists, city clerks, and junior staffers who noticed things were disappearing. After Thornhill burned, the Calderons didn't face trial. Why? Because they had patrons. The same men who funded their asylum, physicians, judges, clergy, also orchestrated its erasure. Within 6 months of the fire, over 400 files vanished from state mental health archives. Newspaper mentions of Thornhill were quietly retracted or redacted. A planned exposé by the Lexington Herald was pulled last minute, replaced with a piece on pumpkin harvests. No follow-up, no reprint, no explanation. But someone did try to speak. In 1898, a Louisville coroner named Thomas Albee published a limited-run booklet titled The Broken Choir, A Physician's Notes on the Thornhill Tragedy. Only 50 copies were printed. Within weeks, 47 were confiscated. Albee himself was found dead in a carriage house behind his home. Ruling suicide, but his wrists were broken. His widow insisted he was about to testify before a private legal panel. She was institutionalized within the month. That's the dusting. A systematized cleansing of not just evidence, but memory. And it worked. For decades. By 1940, no living child of Thornhill was on public record. By 1960, no trace of the Calderon family remained in the Kentucky census. By 1972, the land was repurposed as a state-owned wildlife reserve. No plaque, no marker, no mention. But there's always a crack in the wall. In 1986, a theology student named Ray Kendrick was researching rural churches for his dissertation. He stumbled upon a disused chapel in Black Hollow, half-collapsed, covered in ivy. Inside, a single artifact, a rusted offering box. Inside the box, a page from the Doctrine of Broken Things, a child's tooth wrapped in hymnal paper, and one final note written in red pencil. The dust settles only when the bones stop whispering. That note reignited the search. It drew researchers like Maeve Kennelly, Dr. Helen Marin, and Raymond Vosk, all of whom found pieces the system missed. They followed dead records. They matched handwriting. They ran DNA tests on forgotten hair samples still sealed in paper slips. And with each step, the pattern became clear. Thornhill didn't die. It migrated. The beliefs, the methods, the quiet violence dressed in salvation, still here, just wearing different robes. You want to believe this ended in 1897, that the fire, the silence, the sealed reports somehow closed the door for good. But doors like Thornhill don't burn. They rebuild themselves in shadows. Let me show you how. In 2003, a class action lawsuit was quietly filed in Colorado against a Christian behavioral center known as Red Hollow Institute. The plaintiffs? 7 men, all now in their 40s, who had been sent there in the late 1980s for moral misalignment. That term sound familiar? It should. Because the intake documents obtained during discovery were traced back to a private firm in Lexington, Kentucky, a firm founded by Lawrence Calderon, great-grandson of Nathaniel Calderon. Same bloodline, same phrases, same mirror-based isolation therapy. Red Hollow was just one of many. From 1975 to 2010, over 80 faith-based reformation programs operated across the U.S., all using remarkably similar tactics: solitary spiritual confinement, behavioral resets via deprivation, moral hierarchy rankings, suppression of external names and identities. All of it rooted in the doctrine of broken things, just renamed, reframed, and given tax-exempt status. Still think this was just a dark patch in history? Let's go deeper. In 2015, a whistleblower from a federal juvenile contract facility in New Mexico leaked internal documents. In them, a section labeled Compliance Adjustment Protocol 42C, that code again, 2C, from the original Thornhill files. A 9-year-old girl listed as morally erased in 72 hours. Except now, it's a federal compliance code used for real children in real facilities with real government oversight. Coincidence or legacy? Because here's what you haven't been told. Silas Calderon's journals didn't vanish. They were purchased in 1978 by a think tank in Washington, D.C., the Institute for Human Harmony and Development. Their motto, Reshape the root, realign the fruit. Sound poetic? It should. It's lifted verbatim from the Calderon doctrine. They didn't bury the ideology. They repackaged it, sold it, turned it into programming modules, reformed curricula, corporate training. The same ritual. Only now it wears a suit, a cross, a badge, or a white coat. Thornhill isn't a ruin in Kentucky. It's everywhere. Still watching, still listening, still deciding who is clay and who gets crushed. Beneath layers of dust and doctrine, beneath the burn patterns and redacted files, there was one message that refused to be silenced. Not written on paper, not logged in ink, but carved crudely, violently into stone. On the west interior wall of what remained of Thornhill's chapel basement, behind a rotted piano frame and rusted restraints, researchers in 2007 found a series of deep vertical etchings. 5 words, burned by time but legible: "We died, remember our names." And beneath it, 37 initials. No full names, no dates, just the raw act of memory scratched into granite by hands too small to break free. One set of initials stood out: D.M., Delilah M., the same child whose torn hymnal documented unspeakable horrors. She left breadcrumbs everywhere. But this was not a diary. It was a message to the future. A curse. A vow. A summons. Because Delilah wasn't the only one who tried to resist. In 1891, a staff janitor named Clarence Wren was arrested for allegedly assaulting Josephine Calderon. He denied the accusation, claiming he was trying to stop her from forcing a child into the scalding pool. Clarence vanished from the prison registry 3 weeks later, but his journal, sent to his sister before the arrest, contained floor sketches of Thornhill, coded references to breathing pipes under the chapel, and one crucial sentence: "They erase what they fear, but the names don't stay buried." He knew, and he wasn't alone. A nurse in 1893, a groundskeeper in 1896. Even a baker from the nearby village who stopped delivering bread because, as he wrote, the silence there tasted like iron. These people didn't have power, they didn't have platforms, but they resisted in the only way they could. They remembered. They left symbols scratched into fences. They told stories to children at night about a place where the walls wept. They buried tokens, ribbons, bones, charred hymnals in the roots of pine trees that still stand today. And when forensic scanners surveyed the soil in 2011, they found those same trees growing in perfect lines, planted with purpose, with ritual, with memory, because memory is rebellion, and rebellion, true rebellion, doesn't shout. It scratches, it waits. It survives in initials and whispers until someone, somewhere, finally listens. That's you, right now. You found the story they tried to kill. You've heard the horror. You've seen the symbols. You've met the monsters. But ask yourself, why did they protect it? Why risk everything to bury the truth, unless that truth was worth billions? Because make no mistake, Thornhill wasn't just a cult or a family gone mad. It was an industry. Let's trace the money. In 1876, 3 years after the first correctional deaths at Thornhill, a new non-profit appeared on state records: the Virtue Renewal Trust. Founded by industrialists, advised by clergy, and, unsurprisingly, administered by Elias Calderon. Their goal? To support the moral restructuring of America's youth through applied theology, behavioral reform, and institutional outreach. Translation? They funded asylums, reform schools, juvenile workhouses, all under one umbrella. By 1882, they had received over $1.2 million in donations from rail companies, southern agricultural guilds, and even northern steel barons. Why? Because they provided free labor. You heard that right. Thornhill's non-viables, the children deemed too broken for correction, were often rerouted, via untraceable transfers, to textile facilities, coal preparatory plants, and brickyards, all owned by companies connected to the Virtue Renewal Trust. In return, those companies funneled money back into the Trust's mission. It was a loop, a self-replicating machine of suffering, profit, and salvation by design. Now ask yourself, why would a railroad company care about an asylum for children? Because those children built their tracks, cleaned their engines, died in their tunnels. And the trust? They kept the books clean, rebranded every death as failed moral restoration, sent letters of spiritual closure to grieving families, along with a hair ribbon or a Bible verse. It was spiritual laundering, a soul-for-hire economy wrapped in stained glass and scripture. By 1890, this system had spread to 17 states, and Thornhill. It became the blueprint. Its doctrine, the doctrine of broken things, was studied, duplicated, and modified by other institutions. Some even tried to patent their psychological methods. One, discovered in a 1974 archive, was titled Repetitive Theological Exposure as a Treatment for Willful Delinquency. That's just a legal way of saying religious indoctrination under duress. Now do you see? This wasn't rogue theology. It was strategic programming, built to create compliant bodies, loyal minds, and profitable outcomes. And every burned page, every silenced whistleblower, every missing child was part of the budget. She was the last one who dared to speak. Eleanor Witt, the woman in white, the silent nurse, the secret witness. For years, she moved like a ghost through Thornhill's corridors, watching, stitching codes into linen, hiding messages inside laundry bins and behind furnace grates. But in 1897, just weeks before the fire consumed the chapel and the records inside, Eleanor vanished. No resignation, no burial, no trace. Until 1971, when a sealed envelope was discovered in a private ledger belonging to a long-dead judge in Louisville. Inside was a single letter, signed in faded ink, Eleanor Witt, addressed to no one, titled nothing. But it was her last testimony, and what it contained shook the legal historian who found it so deeply he reportedly burned half of it. The remaining fragment reads, I have seen the children under sleep. They do not dream, only tremble. Mercy doses them before reflection. Elias takes them after. They come back wrong. I stitched names into 22 pillows. If you find them, remember this. They are not dead. They are displaced. The fire won't cleanse what was done here. It will only bury the evidence deeper. But the song remains. You must not listen to the hymn. If you hear it, do not follow. That door is not meant for us. One child still speaks. She lives in the mirror. Her name is Delilah. If you find her name, write it twice, in blood, in breath, in memory, so she can come back. Let that sink in. Eleanor wasn't just documenting abuse. She believed something spiritual had awakened inside Thornhill, something birthed from pain, not prayer. And she wasn't alone. Survivors of similar institutions across 3 states would later describe the same hallucination. A child with no mouth, hair matted to her face, standing just outside the mirror's edge, watching, waiting. Some called her a ghost. Others said she was the voice of the broken. But the most disturbing detail, they all gave her the same name, Delilah, not taught, not published. Remember, the hymnal wasn't found until 2004. So how did they know? Unless something passed through. Unless the doctrine didn't just break bodies, it opened doors. Not metaphorical ones, ritual ones. Because what if Thornhill wasn't just a place of punishment? What if it was a summoning chamber, dressed as a chapel? What if Eleanor's final warning, do not follow the hymn, wasn't poetic, but literal? You were warned not to follow the hymn. But here we are. Hymn 141, recovered from a wax cylinder discovered in a collapsed rectory near the Thornhill site in 1998. At first, archivists thought it was a standard 19th century church recording, until they played it. What came through wasn't a hymn. It was a sound that didn't belong, discordant, fragmented, almost human. In the background, a piano, faintly playing what was once Nearer My God to Thee, but layered over it, Something else. A low, rhythmic chanting. Not Latin, not English. A sequence of syllables that pulsed like breath through iron grates. And then, exactly 1 minute, 41 seconds into the recording, a child's voice, barely audible, trembling, repetitive. It says, "He is behind the glass. He is behind the glass. He is behind the glass." Then silence. The kind that feels alive. Within 48 hours of listening to the full recording, 3 researchers suffered identical symptoms: auditory hallucinations, insomnia, compulsive mirror avoidance. One of them, a woman named Dr. Irene Voss, left a single sentence in her final log before disappearing. "The song doesn't end when you stop hearing it. It ends when you remember it. You want to dismiss it as hysteria. You want to believe this is just a ghost story. But there's more." In 2010, digital analysis of hymn 141 revealed an embedded harmonic code, a frequency pattern designed to disrupt theta waves in the human brain. Theta waves regulate deep meditation, memory formation, and subconscious imprinting. This wasn't a hymn, it was neurological programming, developed in 1892, used on children, refined over decades and embedded into the very walls of institutions like Thornhill, Red Hollow, and others still operating today under new names. They're not singing for salvation, they're tuning the mind, conditioning compliance through SU, and through repetition, ritual, and resonance, and they started with the ones no one would miss. The orphans, the damaged, the unsold, but now it's in school bells, in therapy tapes, in focus music played through your headphones at night. You think I'm paranoid? Why is hymn 141 now property of a private military contractor specializing in psychoacoustic warfare? Why was it removed from all public archives in 2015? Because someone knows, and they're still using it, still rewriting identity, one frequency at a time. It was never just about pain, it was about pattern, geometry, frequency, architecture as ritual. You see, Thornhill wasn't built like a hospital. It was designed like a machine, a spiritual engine disguised in stone and stained glass. When a researcher named Daniel Hawthorne scanned the 1864 blueprints recovered from a courthouse basement in 2003, he noticed something chilling. The layout of Thornhill, the chapel, dormitories, reflection wing, and even the underground chamber, formed a perfect sigil, not a metaphor. A literal, occult structure, based on an ancient symbol found in Renaissance grimoires called the Spiral of Obedience. This symbol was believed to bind the will, fracture the ego, and prepare the mind for possession or programming. And now it was built into an asylum for children. Coincidence? Not when you realize this same pattern appears in at least 9 other institutions built between 1870 and 1930. The Halifax Boys' Home in Massachusetts, St. Uriah's Orphan Refuge in Georgia, Black Hollow Women's Reformatory in Louisiana, each of them shares identical spatial ratios. A central chapel or meeting hall with acoustically tuned ceilings, 4 surrounding correctional wings, a hidden 5th section underground, always circular, always sealed. But here's where it gets darker. Modern buildings, rehabilitation centers, megachurches, juvenile detention facilities have begun echoing the same spatial algorithms, not overtly, not identically, but subtly. A 2019 study from the University of Pittsburgh found that prison architecture across 5 states increasingly reflects enclosure-based circular design, with central control nodes and peripheral isolation sectors, the exact model Thornhill pioneered. And it's not just physical. The ritual sequencing has survived: wake at 4 a.m, chanted scripture or recitation, food denial, silent reflection, group hymns, correctional communion. Renamed therapy, this is programming. This is ritual disguised as routine. And every day, thousands of children and now adults are unknowingly participating in an ancient system designed not to heal, but to reshape identity. Because when the architecture makes you walk in circles, when the soundscapes train your neurons, when the rituals become habit. You stop questioning. And when questioning dies, obedience is born. So ask yourself, how many places you've walked through in your life felt off? How many buildings echo with a silence that doesn't comfort? It controls. That's not design. That's doctrine. Hidden in bricks, carved into ceilings, whispered through speakers you never see. His name has been scrubbed from textbooks, his photograph never published. But his legacy, it's everywhere. Dr. Malcolm Hale, the shadow architect of modern obedience systems, the man who took the doctrine of broken things and turned it into a global blueprint. You first heard his name whispered back in Section 23, in the letters exchanged between Thornhill and the Society for Moral Architecture. He never visited Thornhill in person, but he funded it. And more than that, he studied it. Dr. Hale was a professor of phrenology, neurolinguistics, and symbolic theology at a now-defunct private college in Boston, one with deep ties to eugenics societies and industrial psychology firms. His central belief: spiritual fracture is measurable, correctable, and necessary for social order. Let that settle in. He believed the soul could be engineered, and he used Thornhill as a proving ground. In 1883, Hale submitted a white paper to the Internal Institute of Mental Hygiene titled Sequential Moral Collapse and Reconstitution in Youth Subjects. In it, he outlined a 5-phase program: isolation from family, language, identity, shaming rituals performed before peers, repetitive harmonics, hymns, chants, breathing entrainment, punishment as blessing, turning pain into gratitude, integration of new doctrine, obedience equals salvation. He called it the Palladium Sequence. The Institute rejected the paper, but 4 years later, it became the foundation of Fort Sinclair Juvenile Academy in upstate New York, the first state-funded behavioral reclamation center, and who was appointed its consultant? Dr. Malcolm Hale. By 1900, his influence had spread across at least 37 correctional institutions, including schools, orphanages, and women's asylums. And here's what should terrify you. When the U.S. Office of War Information was formed during WIDI, the agency tasked with controlling psychological messaging and propaganda, several of Hale's unpublished essays were found among the special access folders. One marked Symbolic Harmonics and the American Psyche. He believed entire populations could be softened, made docile, through predictable emotional disruption followed by ritual repetition. Think about that next time you're scrolling. Think about the way tragic news is repeated in cycles, the way outrage is fed by ritual language, the silence that follows, the fatigue, the submission. We're not just remembering Thornhill, we're still living it. Just digitized, globalized, marketed as self-help. The window opens backward. It's a phrase that appeared in 3 separate Thornhill logs, once in a hymnal margin, once in a child's intake file, and once, most disturbingly, etched in blood across a reflection wing ledger. Each time, it was written in the same careful script. Each time, underlined 3 times. But only one person ever circled it. Eleanor Witt. 9 times. Red pencil. No explanation. Researchers dismissed it for years, assuming it was metaphor, a poetic fragment, a child's riddle. Until someone noticed the phrase also appeared in other places, buried in the correspondence of Dr. Malcolm Hale, scrawled in the margin of his Symbolic Harmonics draft, next to a diagram labeled Reverse Integration Pathway, and again decades later in a CIA field training manual on psychological destabilization. Same phrase, same implications. Let me tell you what they believed. The window is the mind's threshold for perceptual truth. Backward is the direction of forced regression, childhood, trauma, pre-language. Together, it means creating an intentional collapse of ego through memory destabilization. This wasn't just theory. At Thornhill, the window referred to a real room, One sealed chamber with a single mirrored surface. One way, but not for observation. According to Eleanor's hidden logs, it was for reflection inversion, a cruel ritual. Children were placed alone inside the chamber, sedated with Mercy's draught, and made to recite hymns backward while staring at their reflection. The purpose? To fracture identity, to induce what modern psychologists would now call dissociation, the breaking of conscious unity, making the child more suggestible, easier to control. And here's the horror. Many of those children stopped recognizing themselves afterward. Some became mute, some forgot their names. A few began calling themselves by others' names, names of previously documented Thornhill deaths. One nurse's record notes a girl who, after 3 sessions, refused to respond to anything but Delilah, even though the real Delilah had vanished years earlier. This is the heart of it. The Calderons didn't just punish children, they emptied them, then rewrote them. And the window opens backward wasn't a metaphor. It was an instruction, a method for reducing a human soul to clay so it could be shaped by those in power. Think about that the next time you catch your reflection, and it stares a little too long. They were never meant to speak, but 7 of them did, the only confirmed adult survivors of Thornhill, scattered across states, renamed by foster systems, buried under layers of silence and misdiagnosis. But in 1984, something changed. A trauma researcher named Dr. Alma Green, working under a grant to study childhood amnesia in institutional survivors, stumbled on a pattern. 7 patients, different states, different names, different lives, all with one strange thing in common: recurring dreams of a chapel with no doors. In those dreams they described a ceiling that whispered, pews arranged in a spiral, and always a mirror that bled. Dr. Green didn't know about Thornhill, not at first. But when she cross-referenced their birth dates, intake codes, and fragmented memories, something clicked. All 7 had been discharged from the same orphanage system in Kentucky, all during the same 6-year period, all labeled morally unfit at age 7. She conducted deep hypnosis sessions, audio now sealed, but transcripts leaked in 2009. What they revealed was beyond chilling. One patient, identified as Patient 04 Lewis, described a long hallway under the church, no lights, only song. There was a chair made of hands, and she whispered, "You're not you yet." Another, Patient 07 Rose, repeated the phrase, "The sky is the wrong way. I came in feet first. The hymn turned my head around." Then she began singing a tune Dr. Green had never heard before, until 2 years later, when she visited the Thornhill ruins and found an etched line of musical notation beneath a crumbled pew. It matched Rose's melody exactly. How do you explain that? These weren't memories. They were imprints, scars of a ritual system so powerful it bypassed conscious thought and embedded itself in the body's rhythm in subconscious time. One man, Patient 03, said something that still haunts the remaining tapes. "They told me the past is a lie, the future is obedience, the now is where they break you." Dr. Green published fragments, then vanished. Her research was absorbed into a private psychological institute affiliated with DARPA. Her surviving patients, 2 committed suicide, 3 disappeared, 2 were placed under federal psychiatric monitoring for life. Here's what you're not supposed to know. Obedience can be taught, but erasure must be earned. And Thornhill earned it, over and over, until the child vanished, and the instrument remained. It was unearthed by accident. In 2007, during a state-ordered environmental survey on the old Thornhill grounds, a project meant to prepare the land for sale to a private developer, surveyors hit something unexpected beneath the chapel ruins. 6 feet down, concrete shell, lead lining, no registry, no records. It was a vault, buried beneath the altar, not listed in any known blueprint, not even the clandestine ones smuggled from the 1864 courthouse archives. The entrance was sealed with 4 iron locks, each engraved with a single Latin word: intus, extra, nomen, vultus, within, without, name, face. Inside, a single object, wrapped in cloth, sealed in lead, preserved beyond reason. It was a mirror, but not just any mirror. A ritual device, roughly 18 inches tall, octagonal, framed in what metallurgists later confirmed was an alloy of silver, arsenic, and human ash. Etched at the base, quod est intus est extra, what is within is without. You don't understand what that means yet, but you will. The mirror was submitted to a federal antiquities lab for examination. They found no reflection, not scratched, not fogged, just blank. It absorbed light. It didn't return it. But here's where it spirals deeper. Over a dozen researchers reported symptoms after interacting with the mirror for more than 3 minutes. Short-term memory loss, audio hallucinations, chanting, water dripping, breathless humming. Sudden vertigo. One technician swore he saw his mother, mouth sewn shut, behind the glass. Most chilling, 3 separate witnesses described an inverted version of themselves looking back, but not just a reflection, an entity, moving before they did, smiling when they weren't, mouthing words that didn't match their own. The mirror was pulled from the lab after 6 days. Its current location, classified, but leaked internal memos suggest it was transferred to Site 47, a known deep storage facility for anomalous religious artifacts. Here's the final twist. A note found inside the mirror's wrappings, water-stained, burned at the edges, signed with a single initial. J. It read, "They will look and forget. They always forget. But it remembers. It watches backward." Think about that. Think about a device designed not to reflect reality, but to trap it, to capture identity and twist it into compliance. That mirror wasn't made for vanity. It was made for erasure. And someone, somewhere, is still using that blueprint. They were just hymns, right? That's what the church claimed. That's what the Calderons insisted. But the songs sung at Thornhill, the ones hummed in the dark, recited backward in mirrored chambers, chanted through tears in the reflection wing, weren't Christian. Not in origin, not in structure, not in purpose. They were something older. In 2011, a linguistic anthropologist named Dr. Avira Nail, reviewing preserved Thornhill hymnal fragments at the University of Chicago archive, noticed something strange. Several of the songs contained no known biblical references, no psalms, no gospels, not even apocrypha. Instead, the melodies followed heptatonic sequences, 7-tone modal scales used almost exclusively in pre-Christian mystery cults. Even more disturbing, when those sequences were played at 60 BPM, the average human resting heartbeat, the lyrics triggered involuntary emotional responses in listeners. Subjects reported crying without knowing why, flashes of childhood memories that weren't theirs, and in 2 cases, temporary aphasia, the inability to speak at all. Let that sink in. These weren't songs, they were linguistic software, designed to restructure identity through resonance. You see, language isn't just meaning, it's frequency, it's rhythm. The right combination of sound, repetition, and emotional intensity can create a trance state. Modern neuroscience calls this limbic entrainment, the hijacking of the brain's emotional center through pattern exposure. Cult leaders use it, militaries use it, media uses it. Now ask yourself, why would a child asylum, buried in the hills of 19th century Kentucky, use hymns that trace back to Syriac purification rites and pre-Roman binding incantations? Because Thornhill wasn't just a place of punishment, it was a temple of reprogramming. And those hymns, they weren't prayers, they were keys. Each verse calibrated to lower resistance, fracture memory, and implant new obedience loops. That's why Josephine played them at night. That's why the children were made to sing while starving, while cold, while shackled. Because trauma opens the gate, and melody walks through it. There's one more layer. Embedded in the margins of hymn 141 were untranslated phonemes, glossolalia fragments spoken only during the midnight rites, but when phonetically mapped and run through modern AI linguistic tools, They match trigger phrases used in Project Monarch conditioning, a 20th century mind control program buried under redacted CIA documents. Coincidence or continuity? Obedience isn't taught, it's sung. Her name today is unknown. But in 1966, she entered the records as Mary Eltha Monroe, an alias assigned by the Kentucky Protective Witness Authority, created just 2 months after the FBI quietly opened a sealed case file labeled THN 47 Residuals. She was 91 years old, blind in one eye. No known living relatives, found wandering the grounds of a decommissioned church in Grayson County. She'd been gone for over 80 years. She carried no ID, just a worn Bible, a pocket watch with no hands, and a scrap of cloth clutched so tightly in her fist the fibers had grown into her skin. That cloth? It came from a Thornhill chapel robe, verified through textile forensics. Mary Eltha, if that was her name, was placed under light supervision at a private elder care facility run by Jesuit staff. For months, she didn't speak, until she began writing. Not on paper, she refused that. She carved, into wood, into windowsills, into the stone wall behind her bed, over and over, a single phrase, "I remember the door, and the door remembers me." That phrase appeared 47 times before anyone understood what it meant. Because in her room, hidden behind plaster she'd peeled with her bare fingers, authorities discovered a cavity. Inside, a small box, a page torn from a child's hymnal, and a set of brass keys labeled in Latin, Intus, Exoria, Vultus, Numina, and at the bottom, a note, scrawled in that same jittered script. They built the door from names, but the names were stolen, so I gave them back. When linguists analyzed the Latin terms, they traced them to ritual opening rites used in ancient subterranean temples to unlock memory through confession. In simpler terms, the keys weren't for a place, they were for a person. Hers, mine, yours. Because Thornhill didn't need to survive physically, it survives in rituals, in systems, in songs you don't realize you're still humming. Mary Eltha didn't escape Thornhill. She carried it, like a scar under the soul, a door she could never close. And now you've seen the frame, you've read the note. So here's the right, comment it, twice, right now. I remember the door, and the door remembers me. This isn't just engagement, it's initiation. You thought Thornhill ended, that the gates closed, the stones collapsed, the story sealed beneath dust and moss and southern dirt, but Thornhill didn't die. It migrated. What if I told you the doctrine of broken things wasn't lost? It was repackaged, translated into clinical terms, folded into policy, and embedded into the systems we trust today. Look around. Modern behavior units, reform academies, diagnostic criteria built to define who is resistant, non-compliant, oppositional. We don't call it moral realignment anymore. We call it behavioral therapy. We call it pharmacological compliance. We call it data-driven education and risk assessments. But the function, still the same. To identify the unmoldable, to isolate the non-viable, to erase the name and rewrite the face. In 2021, a whistleblower inside a state-funded adolescent neurocorrectional facility leaked footage of a program titled Cohort B, Delay Re-Entry Conditioning. Children aged 6 to 11, exposed to subliminal audio while asleep, monitored for surrender response, reinforced through emotionally responsive withholding. A phrase that's just a dressed-up version of controlled neglect, one of the files, labeled Thornhill Protocol 5C. Coincidence? No. That vault you opened with this story, it wasn't fiction. It was a warning. And those who inherit silence inherit obedience. We've seen this play before, from Robbinsbrook to MK Ultra, from asylums to algorithms, from chapel pews to classroom desks. The architecture may change, but the foundation, still ritual, still rhythm, still obedience through fracture. So now ask yourself, where is Thornhill? It's not just in Kentucky, it's in you, in the systems that shaped you, in the labels they gave you, in the lines you were never supposed to question. And if you felt something awaken during this descent, if your pulse shift, if your breath caught, if a part of you recognized what you were never told, then you don't just know the truth, you remember it. Say it one more time, not in comment, but out loud. I remember the door, and the door remembers me. Because once you've seen the mirror, you can never unsee your reflection. And now you know, the real asylum was always built in plain sight. If this descent gripped your mind, subscribe for more forbidden histories and suppressed awakenings. What comes next is darker and truer.